She is an investigative journalist who covers civil rights and racial injustice for the New York Times Magazine. She's a 2017 MacArthur Fellow, which means we just have met two geniuses, whose reporting has also won a Peabody Award, the George Polk Award, and the National Magazine Award. She's a total badass. Please welcome Nikole Hannah Jones.
Thank you so much for being here.
I just want you all to understand the level of genius that has been brought to you tonight. I hope you're getting it. And fabulous hair, let's be clear. Well, we're excited to talk to you a little bit about your work. Before we dive into some of your reporting, I would love to talk to you about an organization that you founded called the Ida B. Wells Society.
Yeah.
And if you all don't know who Ida B. Wells is, perhaps you can talk a little bit about the legend and trailblazer that she was. But you founded it in order to increase the number of people of color doing investigative journalism, which is obviously critically important. But what's your vision in 20 years, in 30 years? What do you want to be different about the news because there are more folks of color doing that kind of reporting?
Absolutely. So if you don't know who Ida B. Wells was, she was the most badass reporter of the 19th century. She was a woman who was born into slavery, who went on to investigate the true causes of lynchings of Black Americans. She had her newspaper burned down in Memphis. She was run out of Memphis. She went on to help co-found the NAACP. She was a suffragist. When white suffragists tried to segregate suffragist marches, she elbowed her way to the front of the line because she refused to be segregated. Yeah, I could go on and on. She hyphenated her name.
When it's time for the crudité.
Right.
Backstage.
I won't be held back from the crudité. I will have equal access to the crudité.
Exactly. She fought for that too. But she also, until recently, most people had never heard of her. She was, as many Black women, cast to the shadows of history, and her true role in investigative reporting was denied. So in 2016, myself and 3 other Black investigative journalists founded the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting because we were tired of being the only Black investigative journalists that we saw. And that matters because I think it's clear in Trump's America that investigative reporting is the most critical reporting that happens in a democracy. It's the reporting that holds power to account, that uncovers the way that power is wielded against vulnerable people, and who in this country are more vulnerable than people of color. But the people who are often doing this work don't come from those communities, don't have the same access to those communities, and so we decided that we were going to change that we were tired of the excuses, which we have all heard in any organization that claims it wants diversity, is we really want it, but we just can't find anyone. That's bullshit.
It is.
And so we decided we're going to train and mentor journalists of color to become investigative reporters so that when we hear in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years that we can't find anyone, we can give you a long list of people because we have trained them ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And a lot of the reporting that you have been doing as of late has been focused on school segregation. And you recently talked about the journey of finding a school for your own daughter. I'll never forget, my mother went to private schools in St. Louis where I grew up, decided to send myself and my brother to private schools. When I asked her a couple months ago if she had it to do all over again, if she would have made that choice, she said, I probably would have homeschooled you, just because of all of the different challenges that young people of color endure in school settings. And so as you were going through this journey yourself, can you talk a little bit about where you and your husband landed on where she would go, and how challenging was that journey for you?
Sure. So this is the part where, all the white people in the audience who have been on the right side of this, I'm about to show you how you're on the wrong side of this issue, right? So,
Ain't that what Alyssa says?
Right. So everyone in here, I imagine, thinks of themselves as very progressive. Yet we live in the 3rd most segregated city in the country, and we have the most segregated large public school system in the country. Which means when it comes down to actually living the values that you espouse in a very intimate way, which is where do you live and where do you send your children to school, most of the people, I would say, in this audience and in the city don't live their values. So that's just the truth of the work that I do. Don't cheer, send your kids to school with Black kids. So I've written about school segregation my entire career, and most of the time that I wrote about it, I didn't have a child. And as we all know, it's very easy to have values and to say what you believe in when you don't actually have a child that you have to enroll in schools. We moved to New York, again, one of the most segregated school districts, and suddenly we're confronted with the question of where were we going to send our own child to school? Were we going to send her to a school that looked like the neighborhood we lived in? We live in Bedford-Stuyvesant, of course, a high-poverty black neighborhood. That's right, Brooklyn is the only borough. And we had to decide if we were going to do what most middle-class parents do, which is use their advantage to get their kids away from poor black kids. And we decided we weren't going to do that with our daughter. So the piece that I wrote in 2016 was about segregation in a liberal city, but also our decision to send our child to a high-poverty segregated school, because I truly don't believe that my child deserves more than any other child. And I think until more of us do with our actions what we say we believe, then we are either choosing to sustain a system of vast inequality for those children who have always been disadvantaged, or we can choose to do things that will break that system down, and that's what we tried to do.
What do you say to, I think there's a lot of people who would say, like, I want to do the right thing, and I want to help build an education system that's fair and more equitable, but I have to choose where my kids go based on the system as it exists right now. And I want my politics to make the world better, but I have to send my kids to a school as the world exists right now. What do you say to parents sort of struggling with that difference?
What I say is, you cannot say that you want equality, yet seek to advantage your own child in every way. Those two things are actually in direct conflict. And I'm not pretending that it's easy. If you read the piece that I wrote in 2016, I talk about, my husband and I argued about this. We had a lot of fears, the same fears that every parent has. You feel guilt, right? You as a parent feel like, I have to try to do everything to give my child the best of everything. But if we do that, then we have to understand that the system we have now will always exist. And that what we are saying is that for those of us whose children already have every advantage, the most important thing is keeping all of that advantage and denying even a semblance of that advantage to those kids who have been disadvantaged generationally. I understand that most people are still going to make that choice to advantage their child. I see my work as saying, I'm going to at least force us to confront the hypocrisy of that, to hold up the mirror and acknowledge we actually don't want equality. So it's not easy.
Yeah.
I know right now there are people who are like, wait till her daughter gets to middle school, then she's not going to live her values. Like people who are hoping that I will fail to live my values. I think about my daughter, and if someday she will ask me, like, Mom, what the fuck were you doing? Like, what? Right? But the truth is, these are children. And children who score lower on test scores aren't scoring lower because they don't care or because they're dumb. It's because they clearly don't get the same education that those of us who have privilege can ensure that our children get. And we need to share that advantage. Because the difference is, do I give up a little bit of advantage that I can make up for? I can give my child tutoring. I can take her to every museum. I can give her everything. I can make up that advantage. But for the poor black or brown child, the public school might be the only shot that they have of a decent life. And we who have privilege want to take that too. And I think that's unfair. We're in a capitalist country. If you want to buy the best education you can with your money, feel free. But these are tax-funded public schools, and just because you're rich, you shouldn't get exclusive access to the best schools.
So we've seen in just the past couple weeks protests emerging across the country against underfunded public schools, from Oklahoma to Kentucky to West Virginia. And these are protests about, not about inequities within the public schools, but about the lack of funding, the lack of teacher salaries, pension issues, writ large across the school systems. And these are teachers protesting for every school, every student. At the same time, you're talking about inequities within the public school system. How do you strike that balance? Because it seems like one of the ways in which you can get parents to care more about inequities of the system, or at least take them on, is by making every school better, right? I mean, what is the balance between making the whole system better while solving inequality within the system?
So, one, I think we should understand that the struggles that we're seeing across the country of underfunding of public schools is a direct result of Brown v. Board and the desegregation of schools. As we start to see white Americans having to share educational spaces, you see a withdrawal of support of public education. That is directly linked. Even in places where there are not a lot of black kids, it is that understanding that once black children get access to those spaces, and you can look at it in terms of public pools, public parks, public hospitals, any place where after the civil rights movement, black people gained access, you started to see a loss of support. So these things are directly connected. But that also shows how the fates of all of us are connected, that you can't contain that lack of investment in schools only to black schools, that it becomes a problem for all Americans no matter what their colors are if we decide that public institutions are no longer important. So I think that is the beauty of integration, is that it ties our fates together. We know that from the founding of this country, even before this country, when we decided that black people were going to be a caste of people who didn't have humanity, who didn't have citizenship, that anytime we have isolated black people away from those who have power in this country, we have declined to give them the same resources or access as other people. When you tie our fates together, that means you can't deprive a black child of a textbook, a teacher. Like, I'm in schools where there's no teacher in the classroom. If your little child is in that class with that black child too, you will best be sure that if a white child is in that class with that black child is going to get what that white child always gets. So it's not to say that there aren't struggling schools that are white, because there clearly are. But what it is to say is if there's a black school nearby, that black school will always have less. And that's why we have to tie our fates together. If we are to be truly a multiracial democracy, and the odds are not in white folks' favor anymore, numerically, who's gonna pay your Social Security? Who's gonna pay for all of the things that we need if we are depriving now 50% of the children born are people of color of a proper education? So, as Malcolm X would say, one day our chickens are gonna come home to roost if we continue to pretend that black and brown children are not as worthy of the same education that white people demand for their children.
Yeah. I want to hopefully end on an up note and
You got the wrong person.
well, no, I mean, but we are indebted to you for holding up the mirror to us, even if we don't want to look and see what's in it.
Thank you.
And yet, holding up the mirror hopefully at least gives us some vision into what can work, even if it isn't working. And so I would just love to know from you as we close out, what good things are you hopeful about? And especially if there's a good thing that you are certain about. We'd love to hear that. She's like, oh, maybe
Any TV shows you like?
know.
So in general, I leave hope to other people. Because I'm always looking at, the long arc of history, which I say is actually a circle that keeps turning back on itself.
Oh, man.
He's like, damn.
The arc of history is long and it bends back to the beginning.
Exactly. Hard to argue. The one thing, though, that I will say is when I first did my first year-long investigation in school segregation, which was about 4 years ago, I set up a Google alert on school segregation and every search term having to do with school segregation, and I could go a couple months without a single article coming up. We weren't talking about it. We figured it was a settled issue. We were done. I get several Google alerts every day. We have a new superintendent or chancellor in New York City schools who is bouted on this issue, at least appearing, who's pushing back against, affluent white parents who have had outsized control in the school district. I think all over the country, I give talks every single week to communities who want to grapple with this issue. I don't think that we will ever do right by black children in this country, but I think we are certainly at a place where we cannot ignore it and pretend that we are progressive people.
Well, us grappling with that truth is due in large part to you and your work.
Thank you.
So thank you for holding up the mirror. Thank you for the work you do every day. Thank you for joining us at Pod Save America. Nikole Hannah-Jones, everyone.
Guys, give it up again for Nikole Hannah-Jones.